this May, so congratulations to all of you. Loretta graduated with a bachelor's degree in math and economics from Barnard College of Columbia University. She received her master's degree and PhD in economics from Princeton University. So let's please give a very warm John Carroll University welcome to Dr. Loretta Mester.
Well, thank you for that warm introduction. I'm curious about how you know about Aberdeen Proving Ground, so I appreciate that. And it's great to be back here as part of the Mellen Speaker Series at John Carroll. This is actually the first in-person speech I've given since COVID, so it's actually really fun to be here, and great to see you, George, and everyone else here. And I had, warm memories of my last time here, and I'm sure it's going to be fun today too. I had the pleasure of speaking with John Carroll students at a session before this one, and I think I feel a little better prepped now for the Q&A session with Dr. Navratil coming up. But before we get to that part, what I thought I would do is I just returned from the FOMC meeting, and as Frank said, the FOMC is the body that makes monetary policy in the United States. So we had a meeting in DC last week, and I thought it would be helpful to just briefly review the FOMC's policy decisions from that meeting and put them into context. And just as a reminder, the views I'll present in my talk today and in the Q&A session are my own views and not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve System or my colleagues on the Federal Open Market Committee. So in making monetary policy, the FOMC is always guided by our strong commitment to achieving the congressionally mandated goals of price stability and maximum employment. And in pursuit of those goals, at its meeting last week, the FOMC took actions to begin removing some of the extraordinary monetary policy accommodation that was necessary earlier in the pandemic. Back in March of 2020, at the start of the pandemic, the FOMC had reduced the target range of its policy rate, the federal funds rate, to 0 to 0.25%, and held it there to support the economy in the wake of that unprecedented COVID shock. Now, last week, the FOMC raised the target range by 0.25 percentage point to 0.25 to 0.5%, and indicated that it anticipates that ongoing increases in the target range will be appropriate. Now, throughout the pandemic, the FOMC has also used its balance sheet as a policy tool, buying large quantities of Treasury securities and agency mortgage-backed securities. And those asset purchases were an important policy response to just the severe strains in financial markets seen early in the pandemic. And they actually then went on and helped to support the economy throughout the pandemic. Now, the Fed ended its assets purchases in early March, and last week the FOMC indicated that it expects to begin reducing the size of its balance sheet at an upcoming meeting. As Chair Jay Powell indicated in his post-meeting press conference, that reduction could start as early as our next meeting in May. So I strongly supported the FOMC's actions last week to begin the process of removing monetary policy accommodation, and I based my support on my assessment of economic conditions, the economic outlook, and the risk around the outlook. In my view, inflation, which is at a 40-year high, is the #1 challenge for the US economy at this time. Now, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a tragedy for the Ukrainian people who are suffering tremendously. So they need to be first and foremost in our thoughts. When you think about the implications of the conflict for the US economy, the situation has already led to strong increases in the prices of energy and other commodities, and it has the potential to further disrupt global trade. Now, events are still unfolding there, and there's uncertainty about the economic outlook over the medium run. That uncertainty has risen as a result of the conflict. But despite the uncertainty, I believe that it is appropriate that the FOMC take action to get inflation under control and put it on a downward trajectory toward our longer run goal of 2% while sustaining the economic expansion and healthy labor markets. So let's talk a little bit about economic conditions. So despite the challenges posed by the pandemic, US economic growth was very strong last year, with real GDP growing at a 5.5% rate, which was the highest annual pace since 1984. And that's well above the trend growth rate, which I estimate to be around 2%. Now, economic activity did moderate somewhat early this year in the midst of the surge in virus cases from the Omicron variant, but then it picked back up again as virus cases subsided. So you're going to see in the first quarter of the year that growth went down quite a bit from where it ended up last year, but then it's going to be picking back up. Now, the pandemic is still with us, but over time, firms and households have become much more resilient to the economic impacts of new variants of the virus. And the strength in household and business demand has really been supported by extraordinary fiscal policy and monetary policy, as well as the deployment of vaccinations, which have allowed the economy to reopen more fully. I mean, one of the reasons we're here today. Growth will moderate this year compared to last year's robust pace because fiscal stimulus is going to wane and monetary policy accommodation is being removed. But despite the risk posed by geopolitical events, my base case is that the economy will continue to grow at a pace that's above trend and which will sustain healthy job gains. Now, strong demand has occurred in the face of very constrained supply in both product markets and labor markets. In product markets, differences in virus conditions and virus containment policies across the globe have disrupted global supply chains. Now, at first, firms thought and economic forecasters thought that the supply chain issues would be resolved fairly quickly as virus conditions improved. But successive waves of the virus continue to affect different parts of the supply chain throughout the past year, and firms continue to struggle getting necessary parts and materials through clogged ports and transportation channels. In labor markets, the economy added 6.7 million jobs last year, and in the past 3 months, job gains have averaged over 580,000 per month. The unemployment rate has fallen to 3.8%. That's only a little above its lowest level during the long expansion before the pandemic. These are extraordinarily strong labor market numbers, especially compared to conditions in the labor market when the economy had to shut down in response to the virus. So think back then, in just 2 months, March and April of 2020, the economy lost about 22 million jobs, and the unemployment rate rose to 14.7%. Over the course of the pandemic, many people ended up leaving the labor force, either because they lost their job or because they needed to care for children or other people affected by the virus. Some decided to resign as they reassessed their careers, and many chose to retire. So labor force participation has recovered significantly over time, but it does remain below its pre-pandemic level, and labor supply has been unable to keep up with the robust demand for labor. So, the econ students here and the finance students here at John Carroll know, right? When demand is out of balance with supply, prices and wages adjust. So the supply chain problems have raised firms' cost of production, and because qualified workers are so scarce, wages are rising, and they're rising at rates we haven't seen in decades. Now, our business and labor market contacts from around the region tell us that they don't foresee wage pressures easing anytime soon because labor markets are so tight. Average hourly earnings have been rising at a 5% pace, and workers with specialized skills and high demand, such as cybersecurity expertise, are seeing significantly higher wage gains. As one of our Reserve Bank directors put it at our board meeting, the economy has moved on from the Great Resignation, where a lot of people were resigning earlier in the pandemic, to the great poaching, where firms are bidding away workers from each other at ever-increasing rates of pay. Now, while higher wages that reflect higher productivity growth are a positive for the economy, the current increases in wages are likely inconsistent with maintaining price stability. So as their costs have risen, firms have been able to pass along some of those cost increases to their own customers in the form of higher prices. Inflation readings are now at their highest levels in 40 years. And while many firms and economic forecasters expected supply chain disruptions to ease in the second half of the year, supply chains actually remain challenged and inflation has continued to rise. So if you look at the numbers, if you measure year over year, PCE inflation rose to over 6% in January, core PCE inflation rose to nearly 5.25%, and the Cleveland Fed's median PCE inflation reached 4%. And price pressures that were once seen mainly in the goods and services most directly affected by the pandemic have now broadened to other items. 80% of the components used to compute the Cleveland Fed's median CPI measure have year-over-year inflation rates of 3% or more, and nearly 60% of components have inflation rates of 5% or more. Now, this high inflation imposes a real burden on households and businesses, especially those that don't have the wherewithal to pay more for essential goods and services. The nominal wage increases over the past year have benefited many families, but for many of them, the increases have not kept up with inflation. In addition, if you look at the incidence of inflation, it's fallen more on lower income consumers because they spend a larger share of their expenditures on the essentials of food, housing, clothing, and transportation. And inflation in these components has far outpaced inflation in non-essentials. Now, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia has resulted in significantly higher and more volatile prices of energy and other commodities. Russia and Ukraine are major producers of several important commodities, including wheat and fertilizer, important for the global food supply, pig iron used to produce steel, palladium and neon gas used to produce semiconductors, which are already in short supply, and nickel used to produce stainless steel and motor vehicle parts. The invasion could further disrupt the already challenged global supply chain. So the situation in Ukraine has added to the already upside risk to inflation. Unless the conflict escalates, the direct effects on the US economy are likely to remain manageable. But the invasion does pose some downside risk to growth in the US since higher levels of uncertainty and a sustained increase in gasoline and other prices could temper spending on the part of households and businesses. But at this point, I view the upside risk to inflation stemming from the conflict as being more significant than the downside risk to growth in the US. Now, I do expect inflation to begin to move down later this year and next, but it's going to take some time, and inflation will remain above our goal of 2%. At some point, the current adjustments underway to increase the resilience of supply chains will help to ease the disruptions, and energy prices will stop increasing, even if they remain somewhat elevated compared to the time before Russia invaded Ukraine. Monetary policy action by the Fed cannot affect those sources of inflation, but it is an important contributor to the downward trajectory of inflation in my forecast because reducing the level of monetary policy accommodation will help to better align demand with constrained supply, thereby alleviating price pressures. Absent such action, with inflation already at very high levels and demand outstripping supply, there are rising risks that too high inflation will become embedded in the economy and persist. Now, this can happen if consumers and businesses begin to doubt whether inflation will return to 2% over the medium to longer run, and their rising expectations about future inflation become part of their pricing plans and wage demands. Consumers and businesses are paying a lot of attention to inflation. And their expectations of inflation over the short term, about 1 year out, have risen with actual inflation rates. Now, so far, their expectations of inflation over the longer term have risen, but they remain at levels consistent with our longer run goal of 2% inflation. So that's a positive. But persistently high inflation readings impose rising risks that longer term inflation expectations could become unanchored. And this has implications for monetary policy. So in an economy that is near our maximum employment and inflation goals and with longer term inflation expectations that are well anchored, it's appropriate for monetary policy to look through supply shocks that temporarily raise inflation above target. But in the current environment, it seems too risky to allow the high inflation readings to persist and just wait until the supply side factors putting upward pressure on prices abate. From a risk management perspective, the Fed needs to take action to reduce excess demand and bring demand into better balance with constrained supply in order to better anchor inflation expectations and put inflation on a downward path to our longer run goal of 2%. So the FOMC has begun that process. As I mentioned earlier, at last week's meeting, we raised the funds rate target range by 1/4 percentage point. And we said that we anticipate that ongoing increases will be appropriate. And we also said that at an upcoming meeting, we would begin to reduce the amount of assets that we hold on our balance sheet. And we're going to do that in a predictable manner, primarily by adjusting the reinvestment amounts of the principal payments we receive on our assets, so by running off the assets. Other details of the plan for reductions are being finalized by the committee. And the plan's going to draw on our experience during 2017 to 2019 when we reduced our balance sheet assets, which had grown in the wake of the Great Recession. But the balance sheet today is much larger in terms of both the dollar value of assets we hold and the assets relative to GDP. And inflation is much higher than it was then. So it's appropriate to start reducing the balance sheet sooner and proceed at a faster pace this time than we did that time. Now, one benefit of that plan is that we will be removing the downward pressure our holdings put on yields at the long end of the yield curve while we're raising rates at the short end. And that reduces monetary policy's distortionary effects on the shape of the yield curve as normalization proceeds. In setting policy, the FOMC is always driven by the pursuit of its dual mandate goals of price stability and maximum employment. Inflation is very elevated, and labor markets are tight by many metrics, yet monetary policy remains at emergency levels of accommodation needed earlier in the pandemic. So we need to bring monetary policy into sync with the current state of the economy. And our intent is to remove accommodation at the pace necessary to bring inflation under control, while at the same time sustaining the expansion in economic activity and healthy labor markets. Now, because longer run inflation expectations are still anchored, and there's a strong underlying growth momentum in both product and labor markets, I'm optimistic we can achieve this by reducing excess demand via our policy actions. And I view getting inflation under control as important not only for the price stability part of our mandate, but also for the maximum employment part of our mandate. The best thing that monetary policy can do to support a healthy labor market is to ensure that the expansion is a sustained one, and that means taking appropriate actions to return to price stability. Now, based on my current outlook and my assessment of the risks of the outlook, I believe it'll be appropriate this year to move the target range of the Fed funds rate up to its longer run level, which I estimate to be about 2.5%. And to follow with further rate increases next year. Now, my path is somewhat steeper than the median path in the March summary of economic projections of FOMC participants, but that path also has the funds rate moving above its longer run level next year. Of course, the ultimate pace at which monetary policy accommodation is removed will need to be data-driven and forward-looking. Given the underlying strength in the economy and the current very low level of the funds rate, I find it appealing to front load some of the needed increases earlier rather than later in the process because it puts policy in a better position to adjust if the economy evolves differently than expected. If by the middle of the year inflation is not beginning to moderate, we could speed up our rate increases. But if inflation is moving down faster than expected, we could slow the pace of rate increases in the second half of the year compared to the first half. The implications of the unfolding situation in Ukraine for the medium-run economic outlook in the U.S. will also be a consideration in determining the appropriate timing and pace of our monetary policy actions. Now, as we've seen over the past 2 years, the economy can evolve differently than expected. The pandemic is not yet behind us, and unfolding geopolitical events could affect the U.S. economy. So, as the FOMC recalibrates monetary policy to meet today's inflation challenge, I plan to stay very attuned to evolving economic and financial conditions and their implications for the outlook. And I think it goes without saying, I remain committed to achieving our goals of price stability and maximum employment on behalf of the public. So thank you very much for your kind attention to these prepared remarks, and I'm really looking forward to our Q&A session with Frank.
Thank you, Loretta. We have some questions that were submitted prior to this afternoon's event. And to follow up on some of your comments, you mentioned that you would like to see a lot of those increases in the Fed funds rate front-loaded. And yesterday, Chairman Powell indicated at the National Association for Business Economics meeting that he at least would would allow for the possibility of at least one 50 basis point increase. So what's your feeling about that? And what do you think the probability is that perhaps we may get one or more 50 basis point increase at a meeting rather than 25, 25, 25?
Well, I don't think 50 basis points should be off the table. My funds rate path is a little steeper than the median path. So if you do the math, I think we're going to probably need to move some of those meetings 50. But we're going to go into every meeting looking at what the data is telling us about the outlook before we determine. We don't predetermine before we go there the size of the thing. But we really need to get inflation under control. And that means we need to raise the funds rate target, and we need to do it in a way that, of course, sustains the expansion, but we need to get inflation under control because that's the best thing we can do at this point to make sure that the expansion continues and healthy labor markets continue. So, I agree with the chair that, we want to look at everything, and, I think we need to bring that funds rate up. It really is still at emergency levels. And of course, the economy, there's a lot of excess demand in the economy. We see that both in product markets and we see that in labor markets. And, we need to do what we can do with our policy tools to get inflation under control.
Thank you. Another question that is a little bit tangential, but not really, would be, do you have any idea about the size of the reductions that you're going to be looking for in terms of the balance sheet? Because obviously that also is going to lead to tighter monetary policy. But, are you thinking, or does anybody have any indications, 50, 20 billion a month, 30 billion, 40, 50? Obviously, you said it was going to be steeper and faster, but given the enormous size of the balance sheet at the current time, what does that mean?
Right. So our balance sheet is $9 trillion at the moment, right, which doubled over the pandemic. So we're going to be reducing it, and we haven't finalized the plan in terms of the numbers that you're looking for. But it's clear that we'll go faster than we did last time for two reasons. One, because the balance sheet is much larger, and it's larger not only in dollar amounts, but also in terms of its share. If you look at assets divided by GDP, which is a good way to think about the size of the balance sheet relative to the economy, it's quite a bit larger than it was. So we're going to be doing that faster. But the other reason that we're going to be doing it faster and start sooner than we did compared to 2017 to 2019 is because inflation is really much higher, right? Back in that point, inflation wasn't at 2%, it was below our goal. right? So it's incumbent upon us to use both of our policy tools, right, to get inflation on a better trajectory. We're going to do it in a way that really we're going to set the balance sheet on a path, right? And it's not going to be our primary tool for calibrating to the economic developments. That's going to remain our interest rate tool. But we're going to do what we need to do to get that balance sheet down. And we put out principles at our January meeting basically explaining how we're going to go about do that. The details of what the path will be, exact path, we're still working through those details.
Yeah. Especially, I would assume your mortgage-backed securities maturities are a lot longer than most of your treasury securities,
Right.
so there's going to have to be some adjustments in that regard as well.
Right. Yeah. So we're going to do kind of what we did last time, which was, allow the balance sheet to run off, and we'll probably have, some kind of make it more predictable, because we always want predictability in this. And then we'll allow those assets to move on. One of the principles that I fully support is that we are aiming eventually to get primary treasuries on our balance sheet, right? So we want to hold a primary treasury portfolio of assets on our balance sheet so that we're not influencing credit decisions or allocating credit, right? That'll take some time to get to, but that's one of the principles that we're following in this journey.
Okay, thank you. I had a question from a student, Bricker Thiel, and it kind of relates to the Ukrainian situation. And you spent a lot of time in your prepared remarks talking about the strength of the U.S. economy. But his question basically says, if this conflict escalates and it becomes more important, what are the implications in terms of economic growth worldwide, which would have, at least secondary effects on the U.S. economy? And, do you think right now the members of the FOMC are ready to adjust to that possible contingency, that we'd actually, suffer really what could be a stagflation event rather than just reduce growth?
It's a good question. So a little bit of background. We're always at the FOMC looking at scenarios, right? So it's not just we've set a base case and say, okay, this is what's going to happen. We are always looking at risk, because there's always risk around any outlook you put out there. So, we do look at scenarios, maybe a geopolitical event like the invasion by Russia of Ukraine. Other things are maybe, what if, inflation expectations, start moving up on the long term. So we always do scenario analysis, and we're always ready to adjust what we think policy is appropriate to what's actually happening in the economy. So, we aim for being nimble in that way, but always with the goal of price stability and maximum employment. So we're uniformly focused and committed to hitting those goals. And then, right, we have to react and anticipate and set our policy given what's really happening in the economy. And that's kind of the approach we take. So, there are scenarios out there around the Ukraine situation, and I'm sure you've seen, some private economic forecasts, right, that, a larger event has larger implications for global trade. It has implications for sustained increases in prices of commodities and oil and energy prices. A lot of the contacts in our district, and we do a lot of reconnaissance across the whole district, say that they're concerned about more on the inflation side of things at the moment from that conflict than the growth side. And I think that as well. But, there are some unfortunately dire scenarios that, not the base case in any way, shape, or form, but I think we're all concerned about that. And there's just a lot of uncertainty around how that will all play out. So.
Okay. This is another student question that is related. I thought it was a pretty good one. What impact does blocking Russia from the SWIFT system, and you could probably explain to people more who don't know what SWIFT is, What do you think that's likely to have on other countries in both the short and the long run?
Yeah.
And is that of any concern?
Yeah. So the SWIFT system is the mechanism for making payments, generally cross-country payments. So I think when the sanction went on, and of course the Fed doesn't set the sanctions, that's a government. There was some focus on whether that in itself would create some financial instability and we haven't seen that at all. So in that sense, that's not having implications. But it'll have implications mainly in the Russian economy, not in other economies, and certainly not in the U.S. economy.
Okay, thank you. This question came in from alumnus James Myers, and I'm not sure how much you're going to be willing to address this, but he asked, what role do you believe the extreme level of fiscal stimulus, federal government expenditures during the pandemic, is now playing into the high level of inflation?
It's a good question. I mean, I think what we saw during the pandemic was both fiscal policy action and monetary policy action that was really unprecedented in terms of its size and speed. But remember, the pandemic was unprecedented. So, I think those levels were necessary, right, to really stave off what were some very dire potential outcomes. And, when we're talking about doing scenario analysis, if you think back, it's hard to think back actually to that March, April 2020 time period, because we've all learned how to cope with this. But back then it was like so much uncertainty. You just didn't know, right? Just think, people were hoarding toilet paper. It was like there was like crazy things going on. You didn't know whether you could get on a plane. You didn't know, could you buy gasoline? Like there was like a lot of uncertainty. So there were dire things going on. So yeah, there was a lot of stimulus put on, but it was necessary to get through that period. Now the question is, okay, we're at a period where supply hasn't recovered, right? It's like whack-a-mole. I mean, our firms tell us like sometimes, well, this supply problem, I had trouble getting this kind of material. We have a firm that does personal care products, right? One type of cloth they had a lot of trouble getting. They finally resolved that, and then this other kind of cloth that they need went into bad supply, got constrained. So it's almost like it's rolling sort of. So that's very constrained, and yet we still have the stimulus. And so what the Fed is doing, right, is a process of, reducing that excess demand. And the reason I think that I'm very optimistic that we can maintain the expansion is because we're really about reducing the excess of demand over supply, which creates that price pressure. That doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to reduce, right, the activity itself or employment itself, right? We're just kind of pushing down on the excess of demand.
And real interest rates are still highly negative,
And we're still very accommodative.
Yeah, in that regard.
Which is why it's a process, not a one and done.
Right. Another question that one of the students submitted, I don't have his or her name, but do you think that all this turmoil that we've undergone, pandemic and now all the embargoes and everything against Russia, do you think we may have reached the peak in globalization and long supply chains that involve two or more countries, in some cases multiple countries?
So I think that, and firms tell us this, and you see it happening, firms are taking actions to make their supply chains more resilient. Now, it's taking time, right? Because you can't just on a dime change your supply chain or build another place that you're going to get. But there's definitely some realization that, we were more vulnerable. The just-in-time inventory, cost minimizing supply chain, I think there's a realization that has a lot of risk attached to it. And you're better off building supply chains that have resiliency built in from the very beginning, because you never know where the next problem is going to arise. So that's definitely happening. That'll take some time. But that's definitely happening. So in that sense, I think there's a realization that, we need to be more resilient. I hope it doesn't mean we're going to become xenophobic and only, become isolationist, because that would be detrimental to the economy. So I think it's going to take some, it's going to take some time to sort of get to the new equilibrium. But again, I think it's more about reducing risk rather than cutting ourselves off.
Okay. I think normally, there's a question here that I think normally, if it wouldn't have been for everything else that was going on, would have gotten a lot of attention, and yet I don't think it has much attention, and that is with regard to the possibility of a crypto form of the dollar. And in that regard, we now have, most of our money supply is electronic. I don't remember the last time I went to the bank, usually I use my credit card rather than coins and currency.
Right.
So given the current state of cryptocurrencies, what do you think might be the advantage of a crypto dollar that some policymakers in Washington, both within the Fed and outside of it, as well as a lot of financial market people, are trying to push this idea of a dollar? So what can it do for us that we can't do now?
Right. So I will point you to a paper that the Federal Reserve put out a month ago, which basically is a white paper that goes through some of the issues and what are some of the potential use cases for cryptocurrency, but also what are some of the potential issues that arise. Financial stability issues, for example, transmission of monetary policy, maybe that would be affected if the central bank issued a digital currency. So I'll point you to that. There's no decision been made in the U.S. about whether to do a central bank digital currency, but it's a nice paper, and it asks for public comment. So people who have strong feelings about this one way or the other, I would urge you to send in your comments, because we're trying to collect those. And there's work going on in the system to make sure that if the policymakers decide to go in that direction, that we can build the technology that would meet the needs of it. But there are some use cases that I think are salient, like advancing cross-border payments would be easier. If there were a central bank digital currency. It's very expensive still, even though there have been some good advances on doing that kind of thing. Some people argue that it could make the financial system more inclusive by offering a digital currency that everyone can get access to. Not everyone has a credit card, for example. Right. And there's actually work going on in our Reserve Bank to actually say, okay, let's not argue whether it would or wouldn't, but let's ask, if that's the goal of a central bank digital currency, what properties would it have to have? And so we're working on that so that we're preparing so that we understand really what the issues are and what are the pros and cons of going in that direction. But again, there hasn't been any decision made in the U.S. about that.
Okay, thank you. This one may imply some self-criticism. Take it whichever way you'd like. But the financial markets reacted actually very positively, especially the equity market. And even though bond yields have gone up, and therefore the prices of all the bonds, treasury securities anyway, have gone down, to me it seems as though the hawkish stance that originally was taken by the FOMC last Wednesday afternoon, and then Chairman Powell's reiteration of that yesterday, are being very well supported by the financial markets. And do you have any comments about that? I mean, because one would expect if, there's a canard, it may be true most of the time, but not always, that if you have rising bond yields, you're going to have, it's a sign of a bear market forthcoming. And we had a couple questions in that regard. Yeah. So,
well, I mean, the financial markets are astute. Inflation's at a 40-year high. They know that that is not a good sign for a sustainable expansion. And so I think they are supportive of the Fed wanting to get inflation under control. And that's how I interpret that. I think, one of the things we hope we're doing at the Fed is explaining the rationale for our policy decisions and making sure that we're not surprising. It used to be in the old days, it was like monetary policy wanted to surprise everyone, and that's the effect. That's not the way we do policy now. We're trying to be very forthcoming and transparent about what we're trying to achieve, right, our dual mandate goals, and what our rationale for making the decisions are. And I think I interpret it as being, they see the same issues that we on the FOMC see, and so they're supportive of us taking action to get inflation better under control.
Was there much discussion of the potential reaction at the meeting prior to the decision being announced last week?
Okay, so I'm not talking out of school here because, if you go and look at some of the documents that are FOMC documents that we put out with a 5-year lag, if you look at the thing that's called Teal Book B, right, in those Teal books, we always talk about, we always look at, the staff prepare these things so they don't front run what the committee's going to do. So there's always like, reduce interest rates, leave them the same, raise them. And then there's always a discussion of, okay, what would you expect the markets to react to those? So we're always sort of understanding that, but that's not what drives our policy decisions. Our policy decisions are driven really by what's the best policy given the economy, where the economy's headed is according to our forecast and where the risks are around that forecast in order to achieve our dual mandate goals. And understanding how markets are going to react is part of the environment, but that doesn't drive the decision.
Right.
If you understand what I mean.
Okay. But it is nice when equity markets at least don't disagree with you, right?
Well, it's an interesting thing, right? Because we take signals from the markets because they aggregate information, right? So there's a whole, literature about, the mirrors, right? Is it us driving the markets? Is the markets telling us information? And making sure that we're setting policy really guided by the dual mandate goals is important for that.
Yeah. We have a question here that's more related to activity in Cleveland from a community member, Ron Burwinkle. And he said, given that a lot of the local economy is based on the healthcare industry, how do you think increased interest rates and tightening monetary policy are going to affect activity here in the Cleveland area?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question because exactly right, healthcare is really important here. Education is too. I mean, in healthcare, they're feeling a huge brunt from the excess demand for healthcare workers, right? I mean, it's a huge issue. Wages are going up very, very quickly in healthcare because there's just excess demand relative to the supply of healthcare workers. So again, the whole goal here of moving the interest rate up is to try to get conditions more conducive to actually having a strong economy. So again, they're going to actually benefit in the end just the way the rest of the economy will. We have to get inflation under control.
In regard to the labor market, it seems the last couple of years, economists were talking about how the labor force participation rate dropped dramatically at the beginning of the pandemic, and it's been very, very slow to recover. And you mentioned the Great Resignation during your presentation. Do you think, there's sort of two schools of thought here. One, that sooner or later labor force participation rate is going to rise. We still have a large amount of labor sitting on the sidelines. But the other is that this may become more or less permanent, that a lot of people have decided to do alternative things. Inside the Fed, have you guys thought about this? I mean, obviously the chairman did, because his remarks suggested that the total number, if you take the number of people working plus the number of job openings that exceeds our current labor force,
Right.
which again
Right.
fits very well with what you were saying earlier. But has there been sort of a shift in this idea that we may have some permanent reductions in our labor force participation rates because of the pandemic and lots of other things associated with that?
So it's a really good question. And of course, early on, I think many of us thought that once, the virus was sort of handled, whatever that means, right, that people would be coming back into the labor force. But we also knew that a lot of people retired during COVID. And essentially what happened was people sped up their retirement, right? So, demographics, if you just look at a demographic map, there was going to be a lot of retirements, right, over the next 5 years. A lot of that happened, right, when COVID hit. People said, oh, I'm going to take the retirement now. So if you take them out and say, those guys usually don't return to the workforce, we aren't really lower than what you'd predict, right? So in that sense, even though the number is still 1% lower than it was labor force participation, there is going to be probably some of that, those people who will be permanently out. But there's the other contingent who had to drop out because childcare issues, elderly care they had to do. They're retooling for a new career because they took the opportunity to I don't really like what I'm doing, I'm going to do that. So those people will come back. And now what's the mix of that? I think that's where economists have different estimates of what it is. But the bottom line is that's going to take some more time. And so we're going to be in this constrained supply, excess demand for labor. Again, that puts upward pressure on prices, and that's why, right, we can't really afford to wait for that to happen. I do believe we're going to see some of those people who had to leave because of COVID come back in. But I think we can't, be complacent about that. We have to take action now.
Okay. And I think this is probably going to be the last question today. It's a very broad question. Given the fact that you were educated at Princeton in your PhD program, and then you went to work for the Philadelphia Fed, where one of your first presidents was very much one of the active monetarists, and I think was on the shadow open market committee for several years. If you could describe a little bit of your current economic philosophy and who, really influenced that. I don't know if that came from a student or somebody else in the audience, but it's very broad and probably a good way to end this.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so many smart people out there, smart economists out there, so it's hard to pick one that oh, this is the right person. Well, my husband's an economist, so of course I'm going to say him.
You probably influence him a lot more than he does you.
We did write one paper together, so. And he's a theorist, so he says, it's my highest cited paper. And I'm like, yay. No, but there's just so many smart people out there. I learn from everybody. I learn from everyone who sits around that FOMC table. It's like, ooh.
I guess somebody wants us to quit.
All right. Anyway, but.
Finish your answer, please.
Yeah. No, I mean, the chairman of the chair people of the Fed, I've learned a lot from how they handle the committee, how they handle the economic decisions. There's just too many to name, so I've had a lot of mentors in my life that I'm very grateful for.
Well, I think this really has become a fireside chat, at least before they turn the light. Somebody must have put an extra log on the fire. But Dr. Mester, I really want to thank you, because I realize this is your first opportunity to make a lot of public comments about your own opinions about what's going on in our economy, as well as your own viewpoints regarding policy. And it's a real honor that you would honor us with your presence here today. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Before we go, is Jenna May? Yeah. Ah, here you are. We have a small
Oh, wow.
token of appreciation for you that Jenna May, who is the president of the Women.
Oh, my God.
will present to you.
Thank you. No, this is wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, sit in here. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
This was great.
Those questions.